Flying to the US, prepare for extremely tight security measures if you come from one of mainly 14 Muslim countries on a new watch list. After the failure of the Christmas Day airline attack, is this a manoeuvre to avoid US domestic criticism over security? What is the likely impact on countries like Cuba and Lebanon and their relations with the Obama administration? And is it any different from its predecessor? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sahil Rahman. The United States has introduced strict new security measures for airline passengers. It follows the failed Christmas Day plot to blow up an American passenger jet. All travellers on US-bound flights will be subject to random screening, but visitors from 14 countries will face additional scrutiny. They include Cuba, Iran, Sudan and Syria, which have been listed by the US as state sponsors of terrorism. The US has also identified 10 other nations as countries of interest. Passengers travelling from or even through these countries will face full-body pat-downs and search of carry-on luggage, full-body scanning and explosive detection tests. Joining me on this edition of Inside Story in Washington, D.C., Richard Miniter. He's the author of the book Losing Bin Laden. Also in Washington, D.C., Ibrahim Hooper. He's the spokesperson for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And in Beirut, Lebanon, Asad Abu Khalil. He's a professor of political science at California State University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. Richard Miniter, can I begin with you, please? Do you agree with this list of 14 countries on the security watch list?
Well, I think it's continuing the Bush administration's stupidity, which is going after large blocks of people instead of we're not doing the right kind of profiling. We need to do relationship profiling. The United States maintains a database of roughly 488,000 names of people who've either gotten phone calls from or emails from or otherwise have contacted known terrorists. Those are the people that you want to be searching. You don't want to search everyone from Nigeria. It's still too large of a group. And you end up alienating the people who might otherwise be your allies. So it's continuing the flawed thinking of the Bush years, and it shows that the American bureaucracy, presidents might change, but the bureaucracy persists in its morbid stupidity.
Ibrahim Hooper, can I have your thoughts on whether this is a good idea?
Well, I think it casts such a wide net that it really amounts to profiling, religious and ethnic profiling. I don't think that it's going to help. It's going to be counterproductive. And we've seen that these kinds of knee-jerk responses have been ineffective in the past. And as the other guest said, this will only serve to alienate the very population that you're trying to reach out to in terms of national security.
Asad Abu Khalil, it would be good as well to get your opinion, just to set us off on this edition of Inside Story.
Well, I think there are 2 points about it. The first one is that it's dumb. The United States, by announcing the list of those countries, is telling Al-Qaeda that next time they want to send somebody to bomb a plane, that he better be from countries that are not on this list. The second point, that this is blatantly and patently political. I mean, if you belong to the list of those countries, and I used to carry a Lebanese passport, those kind of special treatment and searches were in place long before Al-Qaeda came into being. And I have carried an American passport for the last 20 years, and yet, when I left the United States last week, I was subjected to a search that was far more thorough to the search that the Nigerian fellow was subjected to when he was boarding the plane to the United States. The Obama administration is basically following in the footsteps of the Bush administration by throwing in all these countries, try to appease public opinion and to undermine the arguments of the critics. And the fact that Cuba was added to the list only undermines the political motives of the administration.
We'll come to Cuba in a moment and look at both Lebanon. We'll look at Lebanon and Cuba as individual issues in a moment. Just want to sort of get a broad picture of it all. Richard Miniter, I mean, these countries have been in the public domain now as part of this list for, say, 48 hours now, yet most of them have remained pretty quiet. Why do you think that is?
Well, they don't want to make it even worse. I mean, if you look at U.S. policy with respect to Lebanon, for example, I mean, this is a case where the blanket searches for everyone coming and going from Lebanon is exactly backwards. The U.S. should be reaching out to Lebanon. Obama has all but ignored Lebanon in his first year in office, didn't visit the country, nor has Secretary of State Clinton. And we see this bizarre case now where Hariri is going to Damascus to propitiate his father's killers because he's been totally abandoned by the United States and by the West. Now to add insult to injury, after acquiescing to Israel's bombing of Lebanese cities during the 2006 war, we have President Obama, who's supposed to rethink the connection to the Arab world, subjecting them to even greater security measures. Again, we have to be focusing on people who are actually connected to terrorist groups, using all aspects of intelligence to identify those people, rather than searching large groups. And it's not just a case of racism. It's also you tire your security guards by looking at case after case of person who you have no reason to look at. You exhaust them, and they're not looking for people who do fit dangerous profiles. Frankly, even Israel doesn't ban people or subject people from certain countries to specific scrutiny. They look at individuals. So, you know, for Obama to be even less sensitive and less security-minded than Israel strikes me as bizarre.
Ibrahim Hooper, I mean, some might say that these increased security measures, if we're just looking at both the 14 on this list as such, do target, you know, those themselves, and that the US really is tarnishing, as we think mentioned, all with the same brush, and there may be some sympathetic individuals in those countries, I'm sure the large majority of them, who would perhaps be a little perturbed by being put on a watch list.
Well, whenever you subject ordinary people to this kind of selective security screening, you're going to raise concerns, you're going to create hostility, you're going to alienate people. The problem is we've seen a lot of good rhetoric coming out of the I'm sorry, my mistake, the Obama administration since he took office, but we haven't seen it translate into policies. It seems to be, again, just a continuation of the Bush administration policies with some nice rhetoric put on top.
OK, well, let's just put it into perspective for our viewers here. We'll just focus on Lebanon, because in recent years there have been no conflicts involving the US in Lebanon. No attack on American interests has been traced back to Lebanon, though that wasn't the case in the 1980s. In 1983, a car bomb attack destroyed the US embassy in Beirut, killing 63, including 17 Americans. And in the same year, 241 Marines were killed when suicide bombers exploded near US military barracks at Beirut airport. In 1984, a truck bomb exploded outside the US Embassy Annex, where 24 were killed. And that same year, hijackers linked to a militant group in Lebanon took control of a Kuwait Airways flight, killing 2 Americans. Then, in 1985, Hezbollah hijacked and held a TWA flight for 17 days, where 1 American was executed. Asad Abu Khalil, if I come to you, you're in Beirut, sir, and you're fully aware of the politics of the country. Many of our viewers won't know the intricacies of what's been going on in Lebanon, or perhaps have a vague idea. But do you think being put on the watch list as such is a way of keeping an eye on those that may support Hezbollah as one particular faction, and indirectly then Syria and Iran as an offshoot of that?
Let me first say that I take issue with the contention that Israel does not use racist profiling on visitors to that country. Israel has a very long history of these kind of racist discriminations for travelers coming into Israel. On the subject of Lebanon, I think that it is very likely that the Israeli lobby, which wants to equate Hezbollah with Al-Qaeda, probably insisted on the inclusion of Lebanon in order to say that the same terrorist threat that comes from Hezbollah is the same as one as Al-Qaeda, and also the same as in Cuba for some reason. In fact, the only surprise I have is that why did they not include Venezuela and even promise that they would lift Venezuela off that list if Chavez was overthrown by some other movement?
Mr. Minister, in terms of that whole connection, as Mr. Khalil just said then, about the Israeli lobby and their pressure perhaps on the American administration to include Lebanon on the list, would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if the pressure is coming from the Israeli lobby, but we do know this. Hezbollah has killed more Americans than any other terrorist group, with the exception of Al-Qaeda. The passenger on that Pan Am flight was Bobby Steedham. That Navy diver is very well remembered here in the U.S. Capitol, and his family are regular visitors on the Hill. So it's not surprising. One does not have to imagine a conspiracy. Hezbollah has killed quite a number of Americans over the years. Maybe the movement has matured and changed. That's certainly the argument that its advocates make. But when you have such a bloody record of killing Americans, you're going to be labeled a terrorist organization, and you're going to be treated accordingly. It's, I'm surprised by the surprise, frankly. As for Israel being racist, they're not looking at specific countries. They're looking at people.
Mr. Khalil, you wanted to say?
But I mean, the United States is declaring war on all countries that harbor or shelter al-Qaeda. I mean, if the United States want to conflate the threat from al-Qaeda to the threat from Hezbollah, why is the United States not declaring war on Lebanon, for example, where Hezbollah ministers sit in the Lebanese cabinet with which the United States is doing business? So, I mean, there is something more than the actual security measures that ostensibly were behind these decisions. And, I mean, most importantly, somebody needs to explain to us why Cuba was put on the list when Cuba itself was subjected to terrorism and hijacking by groups that have been leniently treated by the United States.
Mr. Huber, perhaps you can shed some light on this.
The Cuba thing is just plain strange.
You have to also wonder why Indonesia and India, for example, are not on the list. The most populous Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, where they've had a severe problem with terrorism. India, more than 100 million Muslims in India, severe problem with terrorism. Why aren't these countries on the list? So it strikes me as a very political list of countries.
Well, I suppose until the American administration can give us an answer, I suppose we have to hypothesize and investigate between the four of us, perhaps. Let me just bring in some of the statements that President Obama actually said earlier in 2009 when he came into office and, as many believe, stretched out his hand to the Muslim world. Let's just remind ourselves about what he said, and we'll take the discussion further from there.
The United States is not and will never be at war with Islam. In fact, our partnership with the Muslim world is critical, not just in rolling back the violent ideologies that people of all faiths reject, but also to strengthen opportunity for all people. I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world. There must be a sustained effort to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to respect one another, and to seek common ground.
Mr. Miniter, do you think there's an issue here that the administration is having to recoil into a defensive position?
Well, clearly they're not listening to the Arab world. I mean, what have they learned in terms of soft measures with respect to terrorism from the Saudis, from the Yemenis, from the Egyptians, or from anyone else for that matter? They really haven't. We see that the continuation of punitive measures like the Predator drone attacks in the tribal areas of Pakistan, which are Bush-era policies. We see long-term detentions and so on. I happen to favor those policies, unlike our other two guests, but it's kind of strange that he's continuing the hard measures of the Bush years while not learning anything from the Arab world, which has been a much more nuanced response to terrorism, where there are softer measures such as the debates within some of the Egyptian prisons with jihadis, in a sense to engage them intellectually and break them free from some of these terrorist movements. That hasn't happened. The U.S. has made no approach in that sense. There's also been no new economic reach out from the United States to the Arab world. What we have is a lofty speech in Cairo with absolutely no actions to follow it.
Indeed, one of the inclusions on this list, as you say, is, well, as we've been talking about, is Cuba. Let's just bring our viewers up to speed with what's been going on with that, because Cuba's inclusion on the list has raised some eyebrows. There was speculation that it's been included so that USA won't look like it's only targeting Muslim nations, while Cuba is still on the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism. Relations seem to be warming. In December 2008, caretaker President Raul Castro suggested he might consider releasing some political prisoners as a gesture towards the US, but in turn called on the US to free 5 Cuban men convicted of spying in 2001. Early in 2009, the Obama administration began relaxing restrictions on Cuba, including some economic travel and telecommunication sanctions. In April, President Obama went as far as suggesting opening a dialogue, though he didn't state that sanctions would remain in place unless Cuba's regime changed. And then there's Guantanamo Bay. It was established over 100 years ago, and Cuba has long been unhappy with its presence. The potential closure of the detainee facility does not necessarily mean the removal of the base. Mr. Khalil, in Beirut, relations had been warming, as we've just said, and there had been some congressional political groups going to Cuba to talk to the regime there. Why do you think they're on the list, and what do you think the long-term situation is in terms of how the United States is dealing with Cuba? Is it all going to backfire?
Well, I think the Obama administration, especially in the last several weeks after the embarrassment of the bombing, the potential bombing on that plane in Detroit, is trying very much to appear that he's being very tough. He is trying to follow the recipe of foreign policy from previous Republican administration, especially the Bush administration. And I want to say that the rhetoric of Obama is now should be considered meaningless, because we have to judge a record that has been accumulating. I mean, basically, he inherited two wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. He kept the war in Iraq, he expanded the war in Afghanistan, and he just added another third war in the Yemen. And now, with the addition of Cuba, he wants to send a message that he is tough against America's traditional enemies, despite changing attitudes towards Cuba among the Cuban Americans who traditionally used to insist on a very hardline policy. The new generation of Cuban Americans are not anymore interested in this kind of continuous demonization of the country of Cuba. I mean, there's nobody going to make a claim that there is a threat that is coming out from Cuba to the United States. But if the contention is being made that he didn't want the list to appear as being, exclusively Islamic, I mean, why didn't he add other countries other than Cuba? I mean, obviously, it's an easy political choice.
Mr. Hooper, can I just ask you what you think of what Mr. Khalil has just said in respect to the fact, and perhaps keeping in mind that perhaps there is midterm elections, congressional midterm elections pending in 2010, and that has to be a thought on the administration's mind as well?
Yeah, I think it is a matter of trying to appear tough and trying to do anything, basically, to look like you're doing something to make people safer. Profiling is one of those things that it makes you feel like you're doing something, makes you feel like you're safer when it really isn't. And the inclusion of Cuba, I think, is just, as I said, just throw that in there to make it look like it's not all Muslim countries. But, you know, after the Cairo speech, hopes were really raised in the Muslim world, in the American Muslim community, that something would be done in terms of a real policy outreach to the Muslim world. Unfortunately, we haven't moved beyond the rhetoric. And we see even the Obama administration couldn't even get Israel to stop its settlement activity. So, you know, where do we go from here? Again, we have to turn positive rhetoric into real constructive policies.
Mr. Minister, if you were an advisor to President Obama at the moment, with respect to Afghanistan, Iraq, now Yemen, in terms of the rhetoric that we're hearing from Washington, how would you be advising him on what he's just said about these 14 countries?
Well, I think this is a boneheaded approach, but what I would suggest is that if the United States does not reach out and provide more aid, for example, to Yemen, that country could become a failed state. There are Iranian-backed militias there in the north, and as well Al-Qaeda as well. Which is both native and also funded from some Saudi and from other places, that are a major problem. And if you think that piracy is bad and that oil prices are high now, let Yemen fail and be taken over by Al-Qaeda or by proxies of Iran, and you'll see that oil prices will double or triple, and you'll see piracy from the Yemeni coast as well as the Somali coast, perhaps making the mouth of the Red Sea impassable and having enormous effects both on the Middle East and on Europe. So Yemen is a major problem. Afghanistan is continuing a failed policy. Clearly, the counterinsurgency strategy needs to be more innovatively followed. But the biggest problem, frankly, is Pakistan, which is the elephant in the room that no one talks about. You've got a shaky, corrupt government that is backed by the United States. And therefore, because the United States backs a corrupt government, large numbers of people, such as the Lawyers Union and many, many others, opposition parties, dissidents, are opposed to the United States, who would otherwise favor the U.S. because we're backing a corrupt government in Pakistan.
Mr. Khalil, in terms of Lebanon, is that perhaps a positive way of thinking about what's going on in Lebanon at the moment, that peace has been restored to a certain extent? You have a democratically elected government, be it a coalition as well, that seems to have made friends now with its arch rival Syria, and hasn't had to have American intervention in terms of the diplomacy. Is that a good thing for Lebanon? And how would Lebanon now want America's help, if at all?
Well, I mean, I think that this sends a message that the United States still insists on associating certain groups and ethnicities with the menace of terrorism. And I also believe that the United States is turning a blind eye to their intervention and roles by its own allies in the cultivation of al-Qaeda. I mean, the previous guest in Washington, D.C. mentioned the role of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is largely responsible for funding, privately or through the state, of the various fanatical fundamentalist movements around the world, from the ranks of which emerge al-Qaeda. And even to this very day, I mean, the funding of al-Qaeda group in Yemen, I don't see any references in the American press to the responsibility, not only of Saudi Arabia, but the Yemeni government, which has allowed al-Qaeda to come into Yemen in order to be used to fight against the rebels in the north. And now we are relying on the same government that officially hosted al-Qaeda to fight al-Qaeda. I mean, that doesn't make sense. And the Obama administration is being quite dishonest with the American people, and yet we are throwing double the amount of aid, mostly military, in order to preserve an illegitimate, undemocratic government which in the past had cozy relations with al-Qaeda.
Mr. Miniter, you were nodding in agreement.
Yes, I do agree. I mean, I think clearly we need a better Yemeni policy towards Yemen, that is to say. And President Saleh has let in these elements back in the day, which have now turned against him. We've seen attacks in Sana'a and elsewhere. And if anything, the U.S. response seems confused and uninterested, where if Yemen flips, if Yemen goes in a bad direction, it is going to be the biggest foreign policy disaster of the Obama administration, and it doesn't even look like they're paying attention.
Mr. Hooper, what's the fallout now for 2010 with what's been said in terms of how the Obama administration will proceed now? Because not only does it have to now bring on board Muslim countries, or certainly the majority of Muslim countries that it's now alienated as well by, you might say, this list, but it's also got to try and win hearts and minds, hasn't it? I mean, it's a classic phrase that most media outlets use.
I think it's going to be much more difficult for the Obama administration to win hearts and minds in the Muslim world, given the policies opening the front in Yemen, you know, expanding the war in Afghanistan, maintaining the war in Iraq. All of these different policies, now these additional screening measures, the inability or the unwillingness to get Israel to stop its settlement building, the inability to bring any kind of just resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. All of these things are adding up, and it's going to make President Obama's job more difficult. And the American Muslim community is sitting there waiting to be helpful as a bridge to the Muslim world, and we're not really feeling that outreach at this level either.
Well, we shall see what the outcome is and the fallout across the globe. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside Story, both from Washington and from Beirut. And thank you for watching this edition of the programme with me, Sahil Rahman. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for your time and your company. Bye for now.